Thank you for joining us today on NetFile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. Urban areas have been at the forefront of the COVID-19 crisis, with 95% of all cases recorded in cities in the first months. Urban areas were faced with a rapidly changing public health crisis, along with challenges in safe public transport, increased water and sanitation needs, use of public spaces, and economic consequences of lockdowns. A new United Nations Habitat report titled Cities and Pandemic Towards a More Just, Green and Healthy Future outlines how a new normal can emerge in cities where health, housing and security are prioritized for the most vulnerable, not only out of social necessity, but also from a profound commitment to human rights for all. Now that many cities are out of lockdowns, is there something governments are doing to prevent business as usual scenarios? And are our cities healthy enough for us? We'll look for answers in today's episode of NetFile. Do stay with us. Clean air, clear skies, and healthy environment are the rare benefits of the global lockdowns. When the pandemic hit, city streets were eerily quiet, passenger traffic plummeted, and traffic-related emissions, particularly carbon dioxide and nitrogen dioxide, dropped accordingly. Gas-powered vehicles directly emit carbon dioxide and nitrogen dioxide as combustion byproducts. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that plays a major role in global warming. Nitrogen dioxide plays a key role in atmospheric reactions that produce ozone and fine particulates, both of which harm health. But today, with the skies open for air travels and businesses back to work, so also is the pollution. The United Nations Habitat, in its new report, is urging governments to rethink how people move through and in cities using lessons from COVID-19. Patterns of inequality characterized by the lack of access to basic services, poverty and overcrowded living conditions have been key destabilizing factors in increasing the scale and impact of COVID-19.
What provides some of the, I would say, initial conditions for the virus and the pandemic to spread in some specific areas. 1 billion people living in inadequate housing, 1 million in slums, 60% of the workforce being informal force. And all this has created or exacerbated these conditions in a way that today UN Habitat, using data from other UN agencies, also estimates that 120 million people in the world will be pushed into poverty, and living standards will reduce by 23%. The conclusion is that income matters.
The UN Habitat report's recommendations include an increased focus at the local level on planning neighborhoods and communities that are multifunctional and inclusive. The report explores how well-planned cities, combining residential and commercial with public spaces, along with affordable housing, can improve public health, the local economy and the environment. It calls for cities to be at the forefront of moves towards a social contract between government, the public, civil society and private sector.
We have seen all how our cities and towns have been hit the hardest by the pandemic. Our data on the initial spread shows that 95% of the COVID-19 cases were in cities and towns. And throughout this pandemic, it has been up to local governments and communities to move quickly and decisively to stop the spread of COVID-19 and ensure an effective response.
The UN, in urging city planners to rethink how people move through and in cities, says an increased focus at the local level on planning neighborhoods and communities that are multifunctional and inclusive must be considered. For many in South Stockton, California, the changes can't come soon enough. Diagnosed with asthma at 8 years old, Colleen Francisco grew up thinking everyone had it. Her friends in South Stockton also carried inhalers and suffered coughing and wheezing fits.
I grew up in school with like everyone having asthma. It was not like something rare for everyone. So I was like, oh, I have it. That's like I'm like everyone else now.
When California began making environmental data available through an online mapping tool, Francisco and others in her Filipino immigrant community realized their chronically underinvested neighborhood, Little Manila, suffered high air pollution and groundwater contamination. It also suffered some of the state's highest poverty and unemployment rates. California's mapping tool is now a model for President Joe Biden's government, as it executes a $2 trillion infrastructure plan that could channel billions into communities like Little Manila. In January, 1 week into his presidency, Mr. Biden ordered that 40% of clean energy investment go toward such communities, with experts realizing these communities first needed to be identified. Mr. Biden's directive also called for the Environmental Protection Agency to upgrade its mapping tool called EJ Screen. A $200 million bill to pay for the software was introduced a day later by Senators Ed Markey and Tammy Duckworth and Representative Cory Bush. As private companies, including insurers and real estate firms, launch their own satellites and deploy legions of researchers and fact-finders, access to data on climate risks or environmental pollution is increasingly seen as a benefit for the wealthy or privileged. The remedy, community leaders say, is to make such information public. Only then can people advocate for themselves. For Little Manila, access to local demographic and environmental data through the state's Cal Enviro Screen Data tool helped to secure $100,000 from the state's emissions trading scheme for a program to teach asthma sufferers how to examine air filters, search for mold spores, and better manage the condition. Their outreach program is called Decreasing Asthma Within Neighborhoods, or DAWN, named after another of the group's co-founders, Don Boulano Mabalon, a first-generation Filipino-American. Don died in 2018 at age 46 after a severe asthma attack. Part of the program includes virtual and home visits by community health worker Omar Gonzalez, who says the goal is to empower those with asthma with greater knowledge.
So with the families that we're working with, I'm pretty much doing the assessment. So what does asthma look like in the home? What is the individual who is living with asthma like? What does that look like? What are their symptoms? How severe or not severe is their asthma?
For Francisco, access to public data gave her awareness of the industries triggering her asthma attacks. She started avoiding outdoor sports and instead practicing indoor volleyball and figure skating.
Like I would tell people, oh yeah, I have asthma. And then like my next friend would be like, yeah, I have asthma too. And we all grew up in South Stockton, and we all grew up by the port, and we all grew up by Charterway, which is by the 5 and the 4. And by all these factories that have all these like toxic pollutants in the air, it's kind of like a second nature to us. So then when I became more educated on these factors of like, oh, you have asthma because of this reason, I was like, maybe this is the reason why I have it.
This freeway.
Dylan Delvo, a co-founder of the community group Little Manila Rising, said rather than blame victims, industry needs to be held accountable. He stood on a sun-baked sidewalk in front of the community's recreation hall and museum, harkening back to the 1920s, when the neighborhood boomed with new Filipino businesses and attracted migrant farm laborers.
The onus of poor health outcomes has always been on the victims themselves. Yeah, we need to start pointing a finger at industry, polluting industry.
In the 1930s, a discriminatory lending practice referred to as redlining began nationwide, making minority and immigrant communities ineligible for home loans. That deprived neighbors like Little Manila of investment and property tax revenue. And when Stockton launched urban redevelopment in the 1950s and 1960s, parts of Little Manila were knocked down in 1968 to make way for the Crosstown Freeway.
This freeway, right, that destroyed our community and is still killing people today.
The data tool draws clear links between high pollution areas and historic redlining. On the map, the neighborhood jumps out in red for its pollution levels and socioeconomic indicators, where their coastal spots in the Bay Area appear in green. Elaine Lapson, Health Equity Director at Little Manila Rising, pointed to the city's history and public policy decisions that have led to the conditions harmful to public health.
And with a lot of the inequities coming from the Crosstown Freeway, pollution burden, and a lot of environmental factors such as the port, a lot of industry, polluters, really creating hard breathing conditions here in South Stockton.
One of the proposals in Mr. Biden's infrastructure plan calls for $20 billion to be spent in neighborhoods that, like Little Manila, have been isolated and damaged by highway projects. As staff at Mr. Biden's Environmental Protection Agency hold meetings with California officials to learn from the state experience, environmental justice advocates hope they will focus not only on California's successes, but also the shortcomings flagged over the years. In some rural California areas, water and pesticide data is missing, and nowhere does the state track race. One coordinator at Little Manila Rising cautioned, however, against relying too much on a data mapping tool. Instead, authorities need to connect directly with affected communities.
I think it's helpful in the sense that it helps everybody get on the same page, and it helps you understand where there are communities of concern and sensitive populations. At the same time, we're being mapped to death, and you shouldn't have to rely on a data set to save somebody. And so we can find all the maps and all the data in the world, but if we don't give power and resources to the people that are being injured by this history, then we're just, we're highlighting a problem and not doing anything about it.
In its latest report, the United Nations Habitat advocates that health, housing and security are prioritized for the most vulnerable, not only out of social necessity, but also from a profound commitment to human rights for all. This requires governments to focus on policies to protect land rights, improve access to water, sanitation, public transport, electricity, health and education facilities, and ensure inclusive digital connectivity.
Why this report calls loud and clear for the need of a new social contract that can be initiated in cities. A social contract that explores the role of the state and cities to finance universal basic income, universal health insurance, and universal housing. A social contract that should be concluded with all social, political, and economic actors. The need for an inclusive approach that involves local communities is today more needed than ever.
The climate crisis caused by unchecked human activities, including unsustainable urban development, is the greatest challenge the planet faces in the 21st century. To a significant extent, the root cause of recent pandemics can be traced to the compounded stress humans have inflicted on natural processes and ecological systems. The spread of viruses and infections in the last few decades has been enhanced and accelerated by rapid, unsustainable, and often chaotic urbanization, biodiversity loss, increased human-wildlife contact, and the prevalence of unregulated live animal wet markets. With 56% of its urban population living in cramped and inadequate housing, just 34% of households having access to clean water or hand-washing facilities, Africa is especially exposed to these risks. Lagos is southwest Nigeria and one of the megacities in Africa in terms of population is a place many experts say leaders need to match high population density with service delivery, adequate living, and circulation space. While Lagos is by far the largest city in Nigeria, security concerns, rural poverty, and hopes for greater economic opportunity are driving people to cities all over the country. In the decade between 2007 and 2017, Nigeria's urban dwellers increased from 41% of the population to about 50%. That is, 1 in 2 people in Nigeria lives in a city. In 2019, there were 7 cities with a population of 1 million or more, 80 with a population ranging between 100,000 and 1 million, and 248 with a population between 10,000 and 100,000. But much of this urbanization is unplanned and chaotic.
We have a huge housing shortage, and especially a shortage of affordable housing. So if you say this community or that community are an eyesore, you're not recognizing the fact that no matter what it looks like, it's someone's home. It's where someone's living. And they're living there because there isn't someplace else. So if you simply try to destroy that place, without providing any kind of alternative, without discussing with them how do we improve the conditions, all you're doing is undermining the human development and the capacity of those people to thrive and survive in the city. So what we need to do is stop looking at problems as problems, but understanding what are the causes of those problems. If it's an affordable housing shortage, if it's a shortage of viable economic opportunities in the formal sector, how do we work with the solutions that people are putting up themselves and turn them into something that fits within the vision of the city that we all share, which is a city that's resilient, sustainable, inclusive.
Currently, over 48 million people in Nigeria live in slums, and the number is rising. According to a World Bank report about African cities, cities on the continent feel crowded precisely because they are not dense with economic activity, infrastructure or housing and commercial structures. The group says the cities lack formal housing in reach of jobs and without transport systems to connect people living farther away, forcing residents to forego services and amenities to live in cramped quarters near their work. The realities of life in Nigeria's cities are hard. In Lagos, about 2 of every 3 people live in a slum. Less than 10% of residents have access to piped water, forcing urban householders to purchase water from vendors at up to 3 times the normal price charged by the state government. Only 6% of urban households have a flushing toilet that is connected to a sewage system.
The attraction of Lagos is the economic empowerment, the promise of economic empowerment that Lagos, gives to people. So, for instance, the Lagos state government has what you could call a sustainable development strategy. It calls it the themes. So it has 6 pillars. It hopes to focus on traffic management and transportation, hopes to focus on issues on health and environment, the entertainment and industry and what have you. And all of this is with the aim of making Lagos a smart city. So smart governance. So I think for a lot of the other states as well, there has to be a reshaping of governance. It's quite important to identify what the sustainable development strategy is for each of the states, and for the states to actually identify that these are my key priority areas, to make, to ensure that there are infrastructures and just to make the quality of life better for the people living in that state.
Many cities in Nigeria, like Lagos, struggle after decades of underinvestment. Swaths of green areas reserved in Abuja to beautify and give it an eco-friendly ambience have been left to wither, and in some cases have become dump sites and places for open defecation. From Benin to Port Harcourt, Kano to Ibadan, and all the major cities across the country is the same story. Water taps run dry. electricity a luxury that does not exist, and mounting hip-hop refuse. But these cities also have the opportunity to learn from mistakes in creating centralized, large-scale public works.
Every high-income settlement, there's a slum growing up somewhere around the area, all right? Because the people that will service the high-income area, low density, they're low-income people. And now, except where you have cheap, affordable transportation, they want to hang around those areas. So they create a belt just around the high-income area. For every high-income area, there's a slum growing up somewhere around. So many cases abounds in Lagos I can give, and also Ogun State is already having such problems. You see high-income locations, and you start seeing people servicing those high-income areas, living in those uncontrolled areas. All right. So, for every serious city or city management, you have to manage both the high-income end and the slums. Slums have to be managed. Slums have to be properly organized, so that you don't transfer problems, inherited problems from the slum, and you don't bring it up there. So there is no way you eradicate slum. They will always be there, and they are never too far away from the high-income end. So you plan it and you have to manage it.
But Nigeria is not the only country in the world that has a rapid urbanization problem. Informal settlements house almost 1 billion people around the world. The world is becoming increasingly urbanized. Since 2007, more than half of the world's population has been living in cities, and that share is projected to rise to 60% by 2030. Cities and metropolitan areas are powerhouses of economic growth, contributing about 60% of global GDP. However, they also account for about 70% of global carbon emissions and over 60% of resource use. Rapid urbanization is resulting in a growing number of slum dwellers, inadequate and overburdened infrastructure and services, worsening air pollution and unplanned urban sprawl. To respond to these challenges, 150 countries have developed national urban plans, with almost half of them in the implementation phase, ensuring that those plans are well executed will help cities grow in a more sustainable and inclusive manner.
And also one of the key important points is the issue of public participation, grassroots participation as well. It's quite important for governance. One of the issues that we tend to overlook in Nigeria is the importance of the local government. So whatever government does, there has to be a top-down approach and also a bottom-up approach.
Experts recognize that environmental deterioration is not inevitable. Although many cities are suffering severe environmental and economic damage, it is not an inescapable outcome of growth. Mounting evidence from cities around the world show that the fundamental challenge has to do with urban governance, better planning and effective management of urban development activities and the human environment.
We've seen research that's been done comparing India, China, and Nigeria on issues of urbanization, and the reality is that in Nigeria, natural population growth is a bigger contributor than migration as compared to those other countries. On our side, what we're doing is working together with communities to find the solutions that we can tackle at our level. But we know that communities and civil society can only do so much if we don't have the government supporting and working together with us. So even if the government is not ready to lead, the government could partner with us to try to find lasting solutions to the various issues. If it's an issue around, urban planning and informal settlements, we have very strong concrete examples of in situ upgrading that's a better alternative to forced eviction. If there's issues around security, let's work on community policing initiatives that can actually work. If it's issues around climate change, we have so many projects ongoing to try to mitigate and adapt to climate change impacts that are likely coming down the pike. What we need is stronger partnership from the government to make those things work well, to make sure that the policies aren't undermining community efforts and civil society efforts, and then to help take them to scale. Because once we've done something well in a few communities, we have a huge network. We're working in 144 informal settlements across Lagos, 60 in Port Harcourt. So we can take innovations to scale. We can start taking this to the level where it will have a citywide and societal impact. But that's where we need the government partnership, and we also need a government that's committed to helping positive development rather than undermining community and civil society effort.
Nigeria is projected to have almost 1 billion people by the year 2100. And with more UNISAs, Asabes and Emekas coming in, Lagos could become the world's largest metropolis, home to up to 85 or even 100 million people by that time. Experts say there is no easy solution and no quick fix. In the meantime, turning the makeshift and informal settlements into livable and sustainable communities across the country is the greatest challenge of our time. Experts have told us that only by addressing the underlying issues of inequality and exclusion in cities, then can COVID-19 be effectively managed and contained. If this task seems daunting, there are also reasons for tentative optimism. With the right policies in place, the enormous economic and social resources being invested to curb the pandemic could help deliver greener, more inclusive urban areas in the long term. I'm Ayola Kasim, asking you to join us next week on the program. But should you have any comment or questions, our inbox edfile@channelstv.com is always available. From all of us here in Lagos, it's bye for now.